Camille Paglia confesses. What she really thinks about modern men. I never thought that the most controversial words about modern masculinity would come from a feminist icon who has spent decades challenging society's most sacred assumptions, but when Camille Paglia finally opened up about what she truly thinks about today's men, her confessions shattered everything we thought we knew about gender, power, and what it means to be masculine in the 21st century. For those unfamiliar with Camille Paglia, she is arguably one of the most brilliant and provocative feminist thinkers of our time. A professor, author, and cultural critic who has never shied away from controversy, Paglia has built her career on fearlessly examining the intersection of sex, gender, culture, and power. Her groundbreaking book, Sexual Persona, revolutionized how we think about sexuality and civilization, and her willingness to challenge feminist orthodoxy has made her both revered and reviled within academic circles. What makes Paglia unique in the feminist movement is her refusal to conform to ideological purity. While many of her contemporaries have embraced increasingly rigid positions on gender and masculinity, Paglia has always maintained a more nuanced, complex view of human nature and sexual dynamics. This intellectual independence has often put her at odds with mainstream feminism, but it has also given her insights that others in her field have missed or refused to acknowledge. The confession that would change everything came during what was supposed to be a routine interview about her latest academic work. The interviewer, expecting the usual academic discussion about culture and literature, was unprepared for what Paglia was about to reveal. When asked about her observations of contemporary gender dynamics, something in her demeanor shifted. The intellectual mask she typically wore in public seemed to fall away, replaced by something more personal, more vulnerable. "I need to tell you something that I've been thinking about for years, but have been afraid to say publicly," she began, her voice carrying an uncharacteristic hesitation. "What we've done to men in the past few decades, I'm starting to think we've made a terrible mistake." The interviewer, sensing the weight of this moment, pressed her to elaborate. What followed was a confession that would reverberate through academic halls, social media platforms, and dinner table conversations across the world. Paglia, the woman who had spent her career deconstructing traditional gender roles, was about to make an admission that would challenge everything her followers believed about modern masculinity. "When I look at young men today," she continued, "I see something that breaks my heart. I see confusion, aimlessness, and a deep spiritual emptiness that we as a society have created through our relentless attack on traditional masculine virtues. We told them that their natural instincts were toxic, that their desire to protect and provide was oppressive, that their competitive nature was destructive, and now we wonder why they're failing." This wasn't the Camille Paglia that her critics expected to hear. This wasn't the feminist firebrand who had spent decades challenging patriarchal structures. This was a woman who had witnessed the unintended consequences of a movement she had helped shape, and she was finally ready to confront the uncomfortable truth about what that movement had wrought. Paglia went on to describe her observations of contemporary young men with the analytical precision that had made her famous, but also with a maternal concern that surprised everyone listening. She spoke of college campuses where young men walked with their shoulders hunched, afraid to make eye contact, terrified of saying the wrong thing. She described a generation of men who had been taught that their very existence was problematic, that their natural masculine impulses were inherently harmful to society. "We've created a generation of men who don't know how to be men," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "They've been told that masculinity itself is toxic, so they've retreated into video games, pornography, and virtual relationships. They've given up on real achievement, real relationships, real responsibility, and we acted surprised when they stopped trying altogether." The interviewer, clearly shaken by these revelations, asked Paglia to explain how someone who had spent her career critiquing traditional gender roles could now be defending aspects of traditional masculinity. Her response revealed the depth of her intellectual evolution and the personal journey that had led her to this moment of confession. "I've always believed in the power and importance of both masculine and feminine energies in creating a balanced society," she explained. My critique was never meant to destroy masculinity, but to refine it, to remove its oppressive aspects while preserving its essential vitality. But somewhere along the way, the movement I helped inspire lost its nuance. Instead of seeking balance, it sought dominance. Instead of refining masculinity, it sought to eliminate it entirely. Do you recognize the men Paglia is describing in your own life? The ones who seem lost, directionless, afraid to embrace their natural masculine instincts. Paglia's confession continued with specific examples that painted a devastating picture of modern masculinity in crisis. She spoke of her male students who no longer participated in class discussions for fear of saying something that might be perceived as sexist or inappropriate. She described young men who had internalized the message that their opinions were less valuable simply because they were male, leading to a kind of intellectual self-censorship that was antithetical to the open dialogue she valued as an educator. In my classes, I used to have vibrant debates between male and female students, she recalled. The men would bring a certain kind of analytical rigor and competitive energy that pushed everyone to think more deeply. The women would bring emotional, intelligence and collaborative approaches that enriched the discussion. Together they created something beautiful. But now the men sit silent while the women dominate every conversation. It's not because the women have become more capable, but because the men have been taught that their voices don't matter. But perhaps the most devastating part of Paglia's confession was her admission about the personal cost of the gender revolution she had helped engineer. She spoke about her relationships with the men in her own life, her male colleagues, her male students, even her male family members, and how she had watched them struggle with an identity crisis that seemed to have no resolution. "I have a nephew," she said, her voice becoming softer, more personal. "He's in his 20s, brilliant, kind, hardworking, but he's been single for years because he's terrified of dating. He's been told that approaching women is harassment, that paying for dinner is sexist, that wanting to protect a woman is patriarchal. So he does nothing. He retreats into his work and his hobbies and convinces himself that he doesn't need companionship. But I can see the loneliness in his eyes, and I know that we did this to him." This personal revelation seemed to unlock something in Paglia, and she began to speak more candidly about the broader societal implications of what she saw as the systematic dismantling of healthy masculine identity. She talked about the rise in male suicide rates, the decline in male college enrollment, the increasing numbers of young men living with their parents well into their 30s, and the epidemic of what psychologists were calling failure to launch syndrome. "These aren't coincidences," she insisted. "These are symptoms of a society that has forgotten how to raise boys into men. We've stripped away every traditional pathway to masculine identity, the provider role, the protector role, to the leader role, without offering anything meaningful to replace them. We've told them that their strength is dangerous, their ambition is selfish, their desire to succeed is oppressive. And then we wonder why they're checking out of society altogether." The interviewer pressed Paglia on what she thought could be done to address this crisis, and her response revealed both the depth of her concern and the complexity of the solution she envisioned. This wasn't a simple call to return to traditional gender roles, but rather a sophisticated analysis of how society might rebuild a healthy model of masculinity for the modern world. "We need to acknowledge that men and women are different," she said, her academic training evident in her systematic approach to the problem. "Not better or worse, not superior or inferior, but different in fundamental ways that complement each other. Men have natural drives toward competition, achievement, protection, and provision. These aren't learned behaviors that can be socialized away. They're biological imperatives that have been crucial to human survival for millennia." Paglia went on to explain her vision of what she called evolved masculinity, a form of masculine identity that preserved the essential vitality and strength of traditional masculinity while adapting to the realities of modern egalitarian society. She spoke of men who could be strong without being oppressive, competitive without being destructive, protective without being possessive. "The men I most admire," she continued, "are those who have managed to maintain their masculine core while developing emotional intelligence and collaborative skills. They're the ones who can lead without dominating, compete without crushing others, protect without controlling. These men exist, but they're swimming against a cultural current that tells them their very nature is problematic. The conversation then took a surprising turn as Paglia began to speak about her observations of women in the post-feminist era and how the campaign against masculinity had affected them as well. Her insights here were perhaps even more controversial than her defense of masculine virtue, challenging assumptions about what women really want and need from the men in their lives. "I've watched young women struggle with the unintended consequences of our success," she admitted. "We told them they should be completely independent, that needing a man for anything was a sign of weakness. But human beings are social creatures. Women, despite all our independence, still have deep psychological needs for partnership, protection, and shared responsibility. When the men in their lives are too intimidated or confused to step into those roles, everyone suffers." Do you think modern feminism has gone too far in its critique of masculinity? Or is Paglia simply nostalgic for a form of male power that was inherently oppressive? Paglia's observations about modern women revealed another layer of the gender crisis she was describing. She spoke of successful, educated women who found themselves unable to find partners who matched their energy and ambition, not because such men didn't exist, but because those men had been taught to suppress the very qualities that made them attractive as long-term partners. "I see brilliant women in their 30s and 40s who are successful in every area of their lives except relationships," she explained. "They tell me they can't find men who are their equals, but when I probe deeper, I realize they can't find men who are confident enough to be their equals. The men are there, but they've been so browbeaten by decades of messaging about toxic masculinity that they don't dare assert themselves in any meaningful way." This led Paglia to what was perhaps her most controversial confession, that many of the relationship problems plaguing modern society could be traced back to the systematic undermining of masculine confidence and identity. She spoke of women who complained about men being too passive, too indecisive, too accommodating, without recognizing that these were the exact behaviors that feminist ideology had been encouraging in men for decades. "We trained men to be passive and then complained that they weren't taking initiative," she said with bitter irony. "We told them that assertiveness was aggression and then wondered why they stopped asserting themselves. We demanded that they suppress their competitive instincts and then criticized them for lacking ambition. We created a generation of men who are afraid to be men, and then we blamed them for not being the men we wanted them to be." The personal cost of these realizations was evident in Paglia's voice as she continued her confession. This was clearly not an easy admission for someone who had spent her career fighting for women's rights and challenging traditional power structures. But her intellectual honesty compelled her to confront the unintended consequences of the movement she had helped to shape. "I feel like we've lost something essential," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "The dynamic tension between masculine and feminine energies that has driven human creativity and progress for thousands of years. We've created a world where one half of humanity is walking on eggshells and the other half is wondering why the spark has gone out of everything." As the interview progressed, Paglia began to outline her vision for what a healthy gender dynamic might look like in the future. This wasn't a call to return to the oppressive structures of the past, but rather a sophisticated reimagining of how masculine and feminine energies could work together in a truly egalitarian society. "I envision a world where men can be strong and assertive without being oppressive," she explained, "where they can compete and achieve without crushing others, where they can protect and provide without controlling, and where women can appreciate and celebrate these masculine qualities without feeling diminished by them." This vision required, according to Paglia, a fundamental shift in how society talks about gender and power. Instead of viewing masculinity and femininity as opposing forces locked in eternal conflict, she suggested seeing them as complementary energies that achieve their highest expression when working in harmony. "The future doesn't belong to men or women," she declared. "It belongs to partnerships between men and women who understand and appreciate each other's unique strengths. But for that to happen, we need men who are confident in their masculinity, and women who are secure enough in their own power to celebrate masculine strength rather than feel threatened by it. The interviewer asked Paglia about the practical steps that might be taken to address the crisis she had identified, and her response revealed both the scope of the challenge and her optimism about the possibility for positive change. She spoke about educational reform, media representation, and cultural messaging, but also about the individual choices that men and women could make to begin healing the gender divide. "We need to start by acknowledging that the current situation isn't working for anyone," she said. "Men are miserable, women are frustrated, and relationships are suffering. Once we admit that, we can begin the hard work of rebuilding a culture that celebrates both masculine and feminine virtues." Paglia's specific recommendations were both practical and profound. She called for educational systems that recognized and accommodated different learning styles and developmental patterns between boys and girls. She advocated for media representation that showed positive models of masculinity alongside strong female characters. She emphasized the importance of mentorship programs that could help young men develop healthy masculine identity in the absence of traditional role models. Have you noticed the changes Paglia describes in the men around you? And do you think society bears some responsibility for the crisis of masculine identity she's identifying? But perhaps most importantly, Paglia called for a new conversation about gender that moved beyond the adversarial framework that had dominated discourse. For decades, she envisioned a dialogue where men and women could acknowledge their differences without hierarchy, celebrate their complementary strengths without competition, and work together toward common goals without losing their individual identities. "We need to move from a paradigm of gender warfare to one of gender collaboration," she explained. "This doesn't mean ignoring the real inequalities and injustices that still exist, but it does mean recognizing that men and women need each other to create a thriving society." As the interview drew to a close, Paglia made one final confession. That seemed to encapsulate everything she had revealed. When asked about her legacy and whether she regretted any aspect of her feminist activism, her response was both honest and heartbreaking. "I'm proud of the barriers we broke down for women," she said slowly. "I'm proud that my daughter will have opportunities that my mother never dreamed of. But I'm also deeply concerned about the world we've created for my nephew and for all the young men who are trying to figure out their place in a society that seems to view their very existence as problematic." This admission seemed to sum up the central tension in Paglia's confession, the recognition that progress for one group had come at an unexpected cost to another, and that true equality would require finding a way to lift everyone up rather than tearing anyone down. "I never wanted to hurt men," she continued. "I wanted to free women. But somewhere along the way, freeing women became associated with constraining men, and that was never the goal. The goal was liberation for everyone, the chance for every human being to reach their full potential, regardless of gender." The impact of Paglia's confession was immediate and far-reaching. Within hours of the interview's publication, social media platforms were buzzing with reactions ranging from vindication to outrage. Men who had felt voiceless for years found, in Paglia's words, a validation of their experiences, while some feminists accused her of betraying the movement she had helped to build. But perhaps more importantly, Paglia's confession opened up a space for a new kind of conversation about gender, one that moved beyond blame and toward understanding. Her willingness to acknowledge the unintended consequences of feminist ideology gave others permission to examine their own assumptions and experiences more honestly. The weeks following the interview saw an unprecedented surge in discussions about masculine identity, gender dynamics, and the future of relationships between men and women. Men began speaking more openly about their struggles with identity and purpose, while women started questioning whether their own attitudes toward masculinity might be part of the problem. Paglia herself seemed both relieved and apprehensive about the response to her confession. In follow-up interviews, she emphasized that her goal was not to roll back women's progress, but to find a path forward that worked for everyone. She spoke about the need for nuance in discussions about gender and the danger of ideological extremism on both sides of the debate. The truth is rarely simple or comfortable, she reflected. But if we're going to solve the crisis of gender relations in our society, we need to be willing to speak uncomfortable truths and challenge our own assumptions. That's what real feminism has always been about, seeking truth, not enforcing orthodoxy. 6 months after her confession, Paglia announced that she was working on a new book that would explore these themes in greater depth. Tentatively titled The Masculine Heart, the book would examine the psychological and social needs of men in the modern world and propose a framework for healthy masculine development in an egalitarian society. Men deserve the same consideration and understanding that we've extended to women, she explained in announcing the project. They deserve to have their struggles acknowledged, their needs addressed, and their contributions valued. That's not anti-feminist, that's pro-human. The announcement of Paglia's new book project sparked renewed debate about the role of feminism in addressing men's issues. But it also inspired a growing movement of scholars, activists, and ordinary people who were ready to move beyond gender warfare toward gender collaboration. Looking back on Paglia's confession and its aftermath, it's clear that her willingness to speak uncomfortable truths has changed the conversation about gender in fundamental ways. By acknowledging the unintended consequences of feminist ideology while maintaining her commitment to equality, she has created space for a more nuanced, compassionate approach to gender relations. Her confession reminds us that progress is not always linear, that good intentions can have unexpected consequences, and that true wisdom requires the courage to question our own beliefs when they no longer serve the common good. Most importantly, it demonstrates that admitting mistakes is not a sign of weakness, but of strength, and that the ability to evolve our thinking is essential for addressing the complex challenges of the modern world. If this story has resonated with you, if you've witnessed the struggles Paglia describes in the men in your own life, or if you simply want to share your thoughts on how we can build a better future for both men and women, I encourage you to leave a comment below. Your perspective could be exactly what someone else needs to hear. And please, if this content has opened your eyes to new ways of thinking about gender and relationships, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. By sharing these important conversations, we can continue building bridges of understanding between men and women and work toward a future that truly works for everyone. Camille Paglia's confession about modern men wasn't just an academic's change of heart. It was a call to action for all of us to examine our assumptions, challenge our biases, and work together toward a society where every person can thrive regardless of gender. The future depends not on men or women conquering each other, but on both sexes finding ways to celebrate their differences while building on their common humanity. Because at the end of the day, we're all in this together, and the sooner we remember that, the sooner we can start healing the wounds that have divided us for too long.